webinar. Oh crap. So welcome everyone to our GEO Fireside chat. Just to show that we're all humans on this panel. This is the last Wednesday of the month. It is also November, so if you're following along at home, we have one more month left in this calendar year. And so everyone has a lot going on, and we want to make sure that this is a robust conversation between myself and the esteemed Dr. Venus Evans Winters, as well as Dr. Keith Jones. I'm simply a vessel, and we'll be answering questions. We will be answering questions likely as they come up, unless it makes sense to wait a little bit. We have some amazing content for you all, some videos. You've heard a little bit of music. Thank you, Dr. DJ Keith. That could be your DJ name. And so we just really appreciate you all spending time here with everything that's going on in your own lives. We want to make sure that this makes sense and is a good use of your time. So welcome everyone. We have, I just want to honor a couple of folks. We have the GEO organizing committee that put this on along with the GSA. And then we have Liz is kind of our hostess with the mostest in the chat. Warren is on deck for tech. So if you have any needs, please don't hesitate to reach out to them directly. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom. We should have captions going so that this can be as accessible as possible. And without further ado, I am going to have Warren.
You muted yourself, Chidima.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Where did I stop? I don't know.
Without further ado.
Oh, awesome. Without further ado, Warren, please show us the land acknowledgement, and I will contextualize that for us afterwards.
I ask that we acknowledge the historical genocide and forced removal from ancestral lands faced by indigenous peoples whose land we stand upon today. In what was once Matapan, we acknowledge the ongoing struggles that colonization and stolen land continues to have on First Nations people here in Massachusetts, including the Chappaquiddick tribe of the Wampanoag Indian Nation, the Sha'una-Agagagamuk band of the Nipmuc Nation, the Harrington Wampanoag tribe, the Nipmuc Tassanamisko band, the Pakasset Wampanoag tribe, and the Sikh Wampanoag tribe. And the many tribal nations that go unrecognized who continue to struggle through resistance and fighting for rights and access to ancestral lands and rebuilding their culture. We acknowledge that many of us here at this time are descendants of oppressors and come from a place of privilege and opportunity. We acknowledge that the many inequities and injustices experienced by First Nations people must be reconciled and healed, and that there is much work to be done. We acknowledge that many of the stories, crafts, songs, skills, and recreational enjoyments that we participate in originate from cultures that have had a close connection to this land for thousands of years. And that from this day forward, we will do our best to share what we learn in respectful ways. Through this work, we can strengthen relationships and begin the process of healing and reconciliation among the First Peoples residing on this land. We give our deepest gratitude to the land, who is our greatest teacher, provider, and source of inspiration. And many thanks to the First Nations people whose land we live, work, and prosper on. To the First Peoples of the East, West, North, South, and everywhere in between.
Thank you. So just to ground us further before I introduce our fireside guests, it's really important in conversations like this to remember that everyone here is learning and unlearning something. Culture is always evolving and changing. And so with that, language does as well. So some of the things that we used to say, we don't say anymore. And so I was torn about this land acknowledgement, if I'm going to be transparent with you all. I think it's very important, not I think, it's very important to acknowledge the land that I'm on, especially what has been done to Native and Indigenous people in this country and in other parts of North America and other spaces. We also want to make sure that we're not getting into performative territory. And so that is the dilemma and the tension. So that's why I had someone else doing it instead of us doing it or myself doing it. So with that, we are humbly entering this space. The two people that I invited to join me in this conversation, I'm so thrilled that they both are in the same room together, Zoom room together, and certainly that I get to bear witness to greatness. And so I'm going to just share a couple words with you all about them. So Dr. Venus Evans Winters is a bold truth teller, a cultural worker and healer who interweaves humanizing dialogue and storytelling into her presentations and writing. The role of educators and healers is to help individuals, families, and communities gain knowledge about themselves, their history, and cultural traditions. Knowledge begins with self-understanding. Self-understanding contributes to feelings of self-worth in individuals and groups. Knowledge is abundance. Educators and social justice activists will be interested in reading her books, academic articles, online commentary on the intersectionality of race, class, and gender in education, social identity, and psychological development. She's also a certified clinical trauma professional, and she is a service provider for Black girls and women in the Therapy for Black Girls directory. The other cool thing about Dr. Venus is that she works with the esteemed Kimberly Crenshaw at the African American Policy Forum, so AAPF. So if you failed to donate to somewhere on Giving Tuesday yesterday, they are always willing to catch your coins. So definitely head over there. There's a lot of great content, and she is their chief researcher, their main researcher. So welcome, Dr. Venus Evans Winters. So glad that you are here with us this evening. And then the next person I am going to introduce is Dr. Keith Jones. He is a visiting assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department here at UMass Boston. His teaching and scholarship situate the cultural production of African and African descended peoples within the entangled, long and ongoing histories of, I'm gonna butcher this word, coloniality and racial capitalism. He attends the intimate and the global in his teaching and thought, and approaches the classroom as a space of shared, precise, and convivial learning. He's currently engaged in two major research projects. The first, titled Sentence to the World, Late Style and Paraliterary Forms in U.S. Fiction, 1975 to 1987, examines the innovations for historical thinking and Afro-diasporic problematic brings to the Anglo-European genre of the historical novel. The second project, titled Figurations of the Baroque, here's that word again, Keith, you might have to jump in. And this second, coloniality, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, it's not necessarily a good formulation.
It's all good. I think it's wonderful. So this second project traces the worlding projects of contemporary Afro-diasporic writers, artists, filmmakers, and thinkers. So He is great with the tunes, great for conversation, and a lot of fun. And so I'm so glad, Dr. Keith Jones, that you were able to join us this evening as well. So welcome to both of you. So wanted to kind of jump right in. And I think, Dr. Keith, you wanted to share with us a little bit about the Debt Collective and kind of situate some things or provide a frame for us to think about this conversation. And Dr. Venus, we'll have you jump in as you need to after Dr. Keith kind of shares with us a little bit more about the Debt Collective.
Well, Chidima, thank you. I deeply appreciate the invitation. I always love being in conversation with you and in solidarity and just aligned in our efforts. And it's wonderful. I don't know all the names here, but I do recognize a number of names, and I'm just happy to be here with you all, and happy to be with you, Dr. Venus Evans Winters, because I am familiar with your work, and I had some questions for you too that I think are deeply pertinent to thinking about the sort of category and the problematic, if you will, of debt and the longer histories that it indexes. So I have a lot to say about debt. I mean, with respect to the psychic life of it, and I think, I'd be interested to know, Dr. Venus, how you approach this as someone who also works within the fields, let's say, of intergenerational trauma, because I think that there are a number of histories that we have to tell and contend with when we're dealing with debt. There's a difference between, and forgive me if this is, I don't know, a complex conceptual formulation, but, please, and also, ask questions in the chat, or, if something's not clear, please just interject, because I do understand that this is just meant to be more dialogic. So let's just, kind of foreground that. And I do want to say also, before I say anything else, that I love that you represent yourself, Dr. Venus, as an educator and a healer, because that's sort of the spirit with which I take up all of my work. And it's sort of, I appreciate, Chidima, you sort of foregrounding the scholarship in a way, but I have to say that I have my own ambivalence about that scholarship when we talk about the corporate university, the colonial university, and the kind of construction, if you will, of its epistemological project, which I'm happy to say more about, which I think is deeply tied up, actually, with the problem of debt and indebtedness, both in our own contemporary moment, but also intergenerationally, and the long structures of at least 500 years for which land acknowledgements become, in fact, quite necessary, right? When we think about the dispossession that they remind us of. And again, I'm already sort of speaking to the kinds of histories that we have to trace. The one sort of in a more synchronic mode, right? Meaning a kind of history of now, would be the one that sort of relates us to, I suppose it's twofold. There's a history of thinking about student debt specifically that relates to the late 90s and the emergence of the real financialization of the universities in a really intense way. I mean, the numbers are just staggering, right? I mean, we know that as of 1999, the statistical measures on student debt were regarded as, quote, too insignificant to measure. They are now $1.7 trillion. That means in the course of 20 years, $1.7 trillion has accumulated with respect to, quote unquote, debt. And I almost wish I could see everyone's faces and I could like get a kind of like amen or an ashe here with respect to like what one also carries with respect to debt. I have student debt. My wife did a medical degree. She has student debt. I mean, there's no one that I know that doesn't have student debt. There's no one that I know. And we all suffer, and also we suffer unevenly, right? In terms of like the racialized and gendered ways in which debt gets lived, debt gets saddled, if you will. I think that's always a very interesting and very important way to think about how we think about debt and how it's lived, this whole notion of being saddled, the burden that it is, right? And you think of saddled, it also, and you think of Zora Neale Hurston, and that Black women are, what did she say? Does anybody remember? The mules of the world, right? That are saddled, right? And Black women carry the most debt, right? Particularly student debt, and I'm not saying anything about medical debt. I'm not saying anything about carceral debt. I'm not saying anything about, mortgage debt is always regarded as some kind of good debt, but we have to be very clear about what debt, how debt functions and what its function is in a neoliberal, global, imperial, racial capitalist machinery that we are in the midst of, right? That all of our bodies are marked by. That's why it's important, I think, to kind of conjure the saddling here. But I want to sort of be clear that there's a way in which we could, in a more kind of contemporary way, a kind of archaeology of the present, would bring us from the late 1990s to the present, right? To now, if you will, right? But then we also have to understand how that happens, and it would require that we go back to the 60s and the 70s, right? And we have to understand then how it was from 1965-ish, 64, 65, when Lyndon Johnson says the university should be free to all, that 10 years later, we have something that's called a crisis of democracy that is produced by the Trilateral Commission that tells us that there is too much democracy happening. There's too many racialized minorities. There's too many women. There's too many, lesbian, gay, queer. I mean, we didn't have all the kind of like robust ways of describing folks that were also non-binary and trans and so forth. But you understand that there was a moment, there was an upsurge, there was an insurgence, which meant that then there was this imposition, and Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California at that time, was the first to impose a tuition increase that essentially meant that it became no longer affordable for all working class folks. And it was no longer, in other words, a kind of public good that people could just benefit from. This is an important history that gets lost, and it's tied up to the prison industrial complex. It's tied into the financialization and the neoliberalization also of healthcare. All the ways in which a divestment in the public then meant that it was the case that everyday folk had to take on the indebtedness of paying for all of those things that should have been social goods under a welfare state. This is that movement, or that massive and problematic and violent transition from a welfare state to a warfare state. Yeah, this happens in the course of the 1960s, right? And it is all in response to all the insurgencies that are happening among, and we all know, like the Black radical imagination and the Black radical project is leading this during this period, right? And it is what is being responded to. So I want to just lay that out. There's a lot there, but I just want to lay out that that's one of the synchronic kinds of tracings of the genealogies of the present that we would have to give. The other is the longer history, and I want to share this with you because it's one of my, it's one of the most important quotes to me from Du Bois, and it's from The Souls of White Folks, not the souls of Black folks. It's an essay that he writes in Dark Water, right, which is a very important collection that is what he writes after The Souls of Black Folks. Very important collections about which I could say more. But when Du Bois writes, whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen, what he's talking about is white settler colonialism. And we have to understand then that these regimes of property, which were the regimes of the history of the conquest of this continent and of all the continents that would follow from European expansionism, right? We have to understand that the debt that we are carrying today, and why it is that certain populations carry that debt in ways that are much more pathological and toxic and ruinous than other populations, is entirely related to this formulation, right? Because it has to do with property. Who owned property and who was owned as property? And the legacies, as Saidiya Hartman would say, the afterlife of this has never been reckoned with. So I understand, again, that's sort of a lot to lay out, and I hope I didn't anticipate too much, Dr. Venus. I hope that's complementary to some of the formulations that that you'll be sharing with us tonight and kind of working us through. I want to share with you, because if you don't know about the Debt Collective, and I'm just going to assume that some of you don't, it emerged out of Occupy, which is another moment also to kind of trace, right, from 2008 what happens to the present. Within the language and the discourse of the debt collective, one of the things that they often say is 2008 becomes this very kind of, crystallizing moment in which we see who gets bailed out and who gets sold out. And now we're not even talking about the pandemic here, right? We're talking about also, this sort of understanding of what the 21st century would bring in terms of an intensification of neoliberal protocols and policies. And it's a logic that is only, I think, again, best indexed by what Du Bois is saying here about these racial capitalist logics of property and ownership and financialization. So I want to play 2 videos, if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me, because I don't want to speak for the debt collective, because this is an organizing effort that was grassroots from the bottom up, and it's remarkable the ways in which they understand that in a kind of like, critical revision and elaboration of, let's say, a Marxian formulation that would place the worker, if you will, all the problematics of that, right? But the worker, not the Manchester worker, not the white, kind of English male worker, right? But like, if you think about the critique of Marxism with respect to the primacy that is given to the worker, quote unquote, worker as a revolutionary subject, right? You have to understand that also with respect to the spatiality and temporality of, the factory floor. We do not share a factory floor in the same kind of ways. And one of the things that they posit is, but we share debt. Now we share it unevenly, right? Different populations share it differently. However, it's this way of trying to, from an abolitionist framework, also think about what it would mean to engage in leveraging our power so that we could begin building the kind of world that we want, right? One, not just without debt that abolishes debt, but abolishes all the conditions that give rise to debt in the first place, right? So could we begin with the your debt is someone else's asset? Thank you.
The American dream used to be owning your own home. Now it's being debt-free. Altogether, Americans owe a record-breaking $15 trillion and counting. Sold as a lifeline, debt is too often an anchor, dragging people down with compounding interest and fees, pulling wealth and resources from the working class to bloat Wall Street's bottom line. Every debt we hold is someone else's asset, with our monthly payments providing steady revenue streams for greedy creditors. Households with credit card debt pay around $1,155 a year in interest alone. Americans now die owing an average of $62,000, much of it credit card debt. A significant amount of the $770 billion of credit card debt sloshing around is medical bills, ambulance rides, doctor's visits, and surgeries paid for with the swipe of a little plastic card. Then there's the additional $140 billion of medical debt and collections, combined with an estimated $50 billion in back rent and $1.4 trillion in auto loans. Much of this debt didn't exist a few generations ago. Consider the $1.8 trillion in student loans this country now holds, which wasn't a problem in the 1960s when college was often free, or close to it. Ronald Reagan helped change that. He made his name by demonizing protesters on the University of Berkeley campus. In 1967, as governor of California, he pushed the university system to start charging students tuition so they would, quote, think twice about whether they wanted to pay to carry a picket sign. During his career as senator, Joe Biden advanced Reagan's project, working to expand student lending. As a senator from Delaware, the credit card industry capital, Biden was a devoted servant of the financial sector. He fought relentlessly for 2005 legislation that weakened borrower protections and made bankruptcy more difficult for regular borrowers, strengthening the hand of the student loan and credit card industries and helping cause a wave of home foreclosures. But debt is not just about money, it's about power. Debt has long been both a source of profit and a tool of social control and racial domination. The founding fathers knew this. Thomas Jefferson argued that debt should be canceled after natural limits, which he took to be about a generation, but only for white men like himself. In 1803, he wrote that debt should be used as a weapon against indigenous people to steal their territory. We shall be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands. Sharecropping, redlining, predatory lending all continued this trend, deepening racial inequities. As a result of the 2008 mortgage crisis, Black and brown families lost upwards of 50% of their collective wealth. For regular debtors, even a late payment can spell disaster. A tanked credit score can make it impossible to rent an apartment or get a job. Default on your student loans? The government can seize your wages, tax refunds, and Social Security. Debtors' prisons are technically unconstitutional, but in practice, people struggling to pay medical bills or court fees can wind up in jail. But not all debtors are treated so cruelly. Rich people regularly walk away from their obligations, and companies engage in strategic defaults. The banks that crashed the economy in 2008, they got bailed out. Donald Trump, the self-professed king of debt, left a string of corporate bankruptcies in his wake. And don't forget that during the COVID pandemic, the federal government spent hundreds of billions of dollars buying up bad corporate debt belonging to entities including Exxon and Walmart, and offering companies, including payday lenders, forgivable loans. It's time regular debtors got a break, too. It's time for a jubilee, the erasure of debts and a rebalancing of power between regular people and elites. It's not a new idea. Jubilee was described in the Bible, and many ancient civilizations had periodic jubilees to avert social and economic collapse. Our earliest recorded histories are stone tablets inscribed with credit ledgers. Nearly as long as debt has existed, debt cancellation has existed too. Throughout history, debtors have risen up to demand relief. In the early 6th century BCE, a debtors' riot helped nudge ancient Athens towards democracy. The reforms, known as the shaking off of burdens, included debt absolution and an end to debt bondage. Something similar happened in ancient Rome after debtors mounted the world's first general strike. In the United States, indebted workers and farmers revolted in the colonial era, and then again during the Great Depression. Later, the call for debt cancellation rang out at Occupy Wall Street. In recent years, striking debtors helped force the government to cancel billions of dollars in student loans. Abolishing medical debt, back rent, and student loans would free up money now spent on debt servicing for other things. People could buy homes and start families, and the racial wealth gap would narrow. Research estimates that canceling student debt alone would boost the economy by up to $108 billion a year and create 1 million jobs. Under pressure from activists, President Biden campaigned on a promise to cancel an immediate minimum of $10,000 of student debt per borrower. Thanks to the Higher Education Act of 1965, he has the power to cancel all federal student loans. With a single signature on an executive order, President Biden can free people from student debt, giving tens of millions of people their lives and futures back. Now, we need to make him do it, and much more. We deserve nothing less than a jubilee.
So question for you, Dr. Keith. I'm looking at the time and I just want to be mindful of what time we have and make sure that Dr. Venus gets an opportunity to share. So why don't we hold off on the second video? We might take us out with the second video. We'll see.
Well, I was going to suggest actually that we just maybe drop that in the chat, because I do think that there, and if I may just say one thing about that gets
absolutely
there, because so for me, whenever I, because my, part of my training and I primarily, some of you know this, I primarily identify as a poet. And so by which I mean that I can only think by inhabiting language in a particular kind of way. I don't mean that in some sort of grandiose sense. I just mean that that's just like haptically, embodiedly so for me. And so when I see a word debt, the first thing I think is etymologically, what does it mean? What is it? How is it later? What's its archaeology, if you will? And the thing that's interesting about debt is that it comes from owe, and owe comes from obligation. And I think it's interesting to think, and this is something that the video raised, when we talk about obligation, when we talk about debt, we should really be asking, what is our obligation to one another, right? Particularly within a society in which we should have public goods, right? Like education that are free, like housing that is affordable, like food sovereignty, right? In ways that ensure that we can live the kinds of lives that enable us to flourish fully. And I think that this question of debt becomes this profound one in which, if we remove it from the way in which it tends to be individuated about our choices, about our failings, the shame that we have about not being able to repay and so forth, we have to really reframe that and think about it as a historical structure that enables intergenerational wealth and theft to continue for some people, and intergenerational debt and theft to continue by other means for others. So I have, obviously much more to say, but I would love to
Totally. Yeah, thank you.
Yield my time and such.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna add something and then pass the proverbial mic to you, Dr. Venus. So I really appreciated what you just shared about certainly the layerings and how complex and nuanced this conversation is. It's not just about debt. It is about that intergenerational trauma. I am going to share a personal story with you all, and I hope that's okay, because the three of us are storytellers, and I would venture to say we're disruptive storytellers. And so it's not just about saying the things that we want to hear. If you're white, you might have some feelings about what we're talking about, and that's okay, because the people that are in debt, to the extent that they have some feelings about that too. And so we are sitting together in productive discomfort as a community, as a family, to figure out how do we get up from underneath this. So 6 years ago, I moved back to Michigan. I lived in Nevada. I lived in Vegas for almost 10 years. And I remember, and Dr. Venus, you might, I'm also a licensed clinical social worker and a therapist now. And so at the time I don't know if broken's the right word. I was struggling, y'all. I was on the struggle bus, and I remember going through this like workbook, and I could not, one of the things was to say an affirmation to myself. Y'all, I could not say it. I couldn't say it. I could not look at myself in the mirror and say that I'm worth being fiscally responsible and financially free. I couldn't say it. And I couldn't say that I am worth being in a healthy romantic relationship. I couldn't say it. I started to say the words, and then I broke down. So that was in August 1st, 2016. So I've been back in Michigan for 6 years. And over the course of that 6 years, I have been able to pay off close to $60,000 worth of debt. That was not easy. And yet today I could stand in front of you all, will sit in front of you in this cozy Zoom room, and share that this was then and this is now, or that was then, this is now, and the work that I had to do. Now there are people, because I had significant shame around the amount of money that I owed. And that 60,000, y'all, is not even the student loan debt. That was other debt, like bad from college and, undergrad and credit cards and this and that, and to my family, So it wasn't even what we're talking about today. And yet there is nothing that's disconnected. And so the sooner we realize certainly that we are all connected, and that all of these conversations, many of you have heard, we not only have a racism problem, we have a connecting the dots problem. And since COVID, we have a reading comprehension problem. And so with respect to all of this, I would love to hear from you, Dr. Venus, kind of connecting the dots for us, further connecting the dots from what Dr. Keith Jones just mentioned. So we're all in this together, and yet there are so many layers that we have not even touched the surface on because we're still stuck on this.
Yes. Thank you all, you both, first of all, for having me here. I would like to bridge all of our worlds together. So interestingly enough, I am a clinician in private practice, as well as a research professor at The Ohio State University. And I'm also the Black Girls Research Initiatives Coordinator at the African American Policy Forum. And so I do want to approach this conversation from a multidisciplinary perspective, but certainly from an intersectional perspective. And I think that, Keith, I love when you said, something to the extent, what are we talking about? We're talking about student debt, right? Or student loan debt. And I would like to unpack that even further, because I like to deal with the emotionality. So when I hear you admit, that, I had this much debt and it was hard for me to say this about my debt, there are certain feelings that come with debt. So this debt, we're actually talking about a moral debt in this country. This is not simply about let's blame the victim. It does have psychological consequences. And when we look at the state of Black women, women of African ancestry in this country, as you know, we actually carry more student debt than any other group of people in this country. One, again, from a strength-based perspective, we do have a love of education and knowledge, especially as it relates to our liberation. And to your point, right, Dr. Jones, this goes back to many politicians, white supremacists, who were invested in us disinvesting or not being able to fully participate in a democracy. So very strategic. And keeping in mind, as a part of this moral debt of America, Black women, African women, we were the largest producers of the future labor force of this country. And this goes back 400 years. So it's impossible to talk about the moral debt without talking about economic apartheid. So let's talk about economic apartheid, and let's call a spade a spade. So what we have to, our next move here, as we talk about, student loan forgiveness, we also have to talk about more research on the perspectives of Black women and young Black women as it relates to our relationship with debt. So, and this has to go back 400 years, right? So now we're talking about reparations. We're talking about segregation from the formal marketplace and also being segregated or cemented to the bottom of our economic stratum, while also producing this nation's labor forcibly, but also voluntarily. Right. So we call for more research on Black women's narratives around our participation in the workforce and also our forced labor. So how is it impacting us, but how does it impact us differently, especially keeping in mind that Black women, there's a reverberation to this moral debt. There's a reverberation to economic apartheid. So as we know here, because most of us are in policy or we do work with people, with communities, we do know that one, Black women are more likely to take care of the elderly in their families, as well as in their communities, cities. Black women are more likely to take care of not only their own children, sometimes as single parents, but also extended kin's children. So when we're talking about mass incarceration, when we're talking about the policing and criminalization of Black children, Black mothers, it's a Black woman, even sometimes our own grandmothers, aunts, who will bring in other people's children while raising their children. Right. We also have to, acknowledge that it is a Black woman that's more than likely, when a relative has faced incarceration, when you're talking about who's going to bail them out or who's going to welcome back into their house after they've been incarcerated, more than likely it's a Black woman. And last but not least, Black women, we are some of the biggest philanthropists. We are the biggest investors in Black civic organizations, whether it's fraternal and or our religious institutions. So think about the moral debt that America owes to African women, to Black women here in the United States and the diaspora, right? So that's the moral debt. So we need to hear these narratives from an intersectional perspective. So how does it impact us, not only racially, but also as far as gender? What have we invested in this nation, and what has this nation invested in us? Nothing, not very much, considering that one, as we found out during COVID, we were more likely, and other women of color were more likely to be essential workers. We were on the front lines during the COVID-19 pandemic. We were also on the front line when it came to the racial reckoning. We were the first one to show up. In fact, Black girls and young women and femmes between the ages of 18 and 25, we were the ones who said, you will stop killing us, and we will not let you overthrow our democracy and rob us of our political rights. So again, we are the moral consciousness of this country. So economic apartheid alongside a moral debt. Yet we face not only segregation and lower tier work, but also there's pay inequity. So we're more likely to do the same jobs as our white male peers, but yet we're also getting paid less than our white male and white female colleagues or peers, right? We also have to talk about income and the wealth gap. Now we're talking about generations, and that's exactly what Keith pointed out. We're talking about generations. We're going back to the 1600s, right? So not only free labor, forced labor, but also we gave our maternal labor, not to mention our emotional labor to this nation and other people, right? Again, forcibly, but sometimes too voluntarily. So we got to really, from a policy perspective, we need to interrogate, as we're talking about debts, we also have to interrogate income and wealth inequity in this country and the debt. And also we need to account for time out of the labor market. We don't really talk about that. Now, those of us who are affiliated with universities, and I'm about to age myself, but hell, you brought it up. So when everyone the tape, some of us witnessed firsthand what's been going on in the last 10 years. So we're talking about the psychological cost of the moral debt or economic apartheid. We have to confront the reality that all of us are not positioned alongside student debt evenly. So we can see the shame and guilt, but we also think about the pride, right? So she was like, oh yeah, so I paid it off. Well, some of us, and I happen to be a part of this generation, right? I benefited from affirmative action. I did. I benefited from an affirmative action in higher education. I also benefited when our government, the state and federal governments, were investing in the education of Black people. So basically you come to our school, we'll help you through these grants. Our interest rates were a little lower, right? And most of us had fellowships, and they created pipelines. But then we woke up one day, approximately 10 years ago, and we found out that the same people, let's talk about algorithms. And we've been watching it. I like to give the example. This is the most simplistic example I can give. So I have friends, family members, maybe even neighbors, complete strangers. And this is some of our juxtaposition to capitalism, let's say it that way, right? So we're on these social media sites. What the algorithms will do, they'll send people to us, and somebody will look at me and they say, oh my God, look at Dr. V. Oh my God, her lips look like mine. Look at Dr. V, her forehead looks like mine. Oh my God, Dr. V, her hair looks like mine. Before you know it, the algorithms, the corporate gods in bed with universities has said, I look just like her. I can become a PhD or have a doctorate degree just like her. And before you know it, the algorithm gods have connected us. The only problem with these narratives is they're not telling you that I went to school, to college, to university, grad school at a time when the governments were investing in our education, differentially, but there was some investment. But also it's convincing them every day, in order for you to feel good or to be somebody, you need to get this degree. Right. So now we have to talk about not only, when we're taken out of the labor market for whatever reason, right, but also what's being sold to us as we want to further our education, our knowledge, our skill-based, et cetera, right, especially in the so-called knowledge economy or skill-based economy. And so we have these algorithms that's also, messing with our heads, for the lack of a better term. And so now we have to have real serious conversations, again, from a gender and race perspective, on not only the moral debt and economic apartheid, but also exploitive capitalism. What happens when our educational institutions and our governments are exploiting people for profit? Because now we have private loans. Now we have higher interest rates when it comes to college. And the other thing is, we're not telling people that you're not guaranteed a job. So what happens when a government or institution is producing, let's say hundreds of advanced level graduate students, doc students, or students, period, and tell them they have to go to school in order to advance, but not promising them a job at the end of that financial investment. So we have to become unashamed of talking about money and telling our story. Second, predatory marketing. It's predatory marketing. And we now know, because a lot of these social medias or technology gurus, right? I call them gods purposely, because they're controlling our thinking, they're controlling our behavior. It was just announced that Americans on Friday spent approximately $9 billion on Black Friday. And I thought, during an inflation, a projected, recession, I said, that's dangerous. But then I had to say, we cannot blame the victim for that, because for 364 days, these same technology corporate gods were actually controlling and manipulating how we think about our relationship to goods and services. Okay. So how do we talk about that? And how do we have honest conversations around that in education for liberation? So that's predatory marketing. We also have to talk about bait and switch as it relates to economic apartheid, the moral debt, and also the student loan debt, right? So bait and switch is, hey, I'm going to give you this type of education, and then in return, you're going to get this. Well, as you all know, it's like that false advertisement. I remember years ago, I'm not going to say the store, but there was this major store during Black Friday. Everybody was waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning so that they could be in the parking lot at 5 o'clock. When the doors opened at 6 o'clock, they wanted to be the first one to this name brand, big screen television, only to get there and find out it was only one of its kind. And the rest were like these generic models that everybody was going to fight over. That's bait and switch. That's false advertisement. And then and again, I think we've already talked about the history and relationship of higher education to white supremacy, but certainly we talked about the privatization of higher education. So we can't just simply blame the victim. And if we're going to look at this from a more holistic perspective, we do have to take intersectionality in mind, and we do have to talk about economic apartheid alongside the moral debt. And now we're going to ask a question differently. Who is the victim of this debt, as opposed to who is actually inflicting the pain and trauma of debt? So that's the moral debt of America.
That's right. I could listen to both of y'all all day. I think one of the key points, Dr. Venus, that you just mentioned was, you tied in a lot of things. And so I've dropped in the chat a couple things from Forbes and HBR, which is Harvard Business Review. The theme that you just said about, looking at, it reminds me of a book that is on my to-do list to read, of what happened to you. So instead of asking what's wrong with you, we need to be asking folks what happened to you, because likely there's some trauma that the person has experienced, and anyone that's carrying any measure of debt is experiencing trauma, y'all. So just so that we're clear. In addition, the hypocrisy, you're illuminating the hypocrisy in this country. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy. I won't even take us down the path of how civilized we are in this nation, considering that Nigeria, I'm a US born Nigerian, is considered an asshole country. And I'm like, we might be that, right? I think it's us. We have people scaling walls and capitals and work boots on speaker desks. So, but that's civilized, right? Oftentimes we like to challenge and say, well, I did it, so, right? Mm-hmm. And everyone doesn't have those same opportunities. In addition to that, we have this bullshit, I'm going to swear, and I know we're recorded, narrative of the bootstraps, right? And so never mind the fact that not everyone has boots, not everyone has the bootstraps. We have told people in this country that if you go to university, you will get that job, right? We've made a promise. And so people are taking on this debt with that expectation. Mm-hmm. What they don't understand is people that look like Dr. Venus and I, we are evaluated the lowest if we're going to group it by race, ethnicity, and gender. as educators. We probably do the best job, but we are evaluated the lowest. And that plays into tenure decisions, that plays into promotion decisions. And so we are getting further and further away from our colleagues who might look differently than us and are maybe doing the same work as us or more substandard work, right? In addition, just thinking a little bit further out, your connection about who's doing the work in the community. So when you're talking about Black women going to school, raising little people, remaining connected to someone who may be incarcerated or may be ill, may have mental health concerns in addition to physical concerns, working a job because they're not paid well. Hello, UMass Boston graduate employees. All of this is connected, right? I hope administration is listening. I'll probably get in trouble, but I don't really care. All of this is connected. So Dr. Keith, you wanted to jump in.
I mean, I could, but I don't. No. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So there's.
And once you're done, we'll segue into a couple of questions.
So, I appreciate very much, Venus, the way in which you were framing this. It corresponds to so much of the kind of groundedness that I have in my own understanding of this phenomena. But I wanna say something a little bit different, if I may. And one of the ways in which I might problematize even the video that we just watched, and I actually think that the Debt Collective, there's a number of works that they've just published. I put something by Haymarket that some of them have just recently published, and there's a lot more nuance, obviously, in some of their publications than we find here. One of the problematic dimensions here is, and I always have to, kind of evoke Malcolm X here. It's like the American dream or the American nightmare. And what is it, in fact, that we're being included in? You talked about predatory inclusion, right? And we have to think, this is a Kianga-Yamada-Taylor formulation that's really important to understanding all of the ways in which we also have to be very careful about thinking through the terms of the desiring that we take on and internalize in the process of becoming quote unquote subjects within this republic, and what that means, what kinds of gazes we take on. This is that psychic life that is internal to us all, right? This is the anti-Blackness. This is the, misogyny. This is all the hetero patriarchal kinds of formations that become part of actually all the ways in which we get trained, right? And no matter how much we try to unlearn that, that is deeply constitutive of the education that we receive, because that's the way in which as you were, I think, beautifully and brilliantly alluding to, all the reproductive dimensions of Black women's labor. That is one instance, and the most kind of egregious of all the ways in which reproduction happens every day in all these brutal forms within the kind of racial capitalist regimes that we live under. And the university is, in fact, the site where all those justifications occur ideologically. And we shouldn't confuse that or be naive to what the university actually is and how it functions. And so then when you think about the debt in this privatization model that's happening for what should be a public good, but in fact, and this is a kind of a reprisal of, the Du Boisian and Booker T. Washington kinds of debates with respect to, is it a liberal arts education, or should we be promoting a vocational kind of curriculum, right? And in many ways, that's been generalized now across our universities, across our public spaces, because there is this way in which more and more students that we have are entering are entering the university with the expectation of that job. Now, I'm not saying that people don't need to eat, But you mentioned something that I talk about all the time in my class, Venus, which is like that we need to maintain a distinction and be clear about that. There's an education for mobility and there's an education for liberation. What about that education for liberation, which is to say, then what kind of consciousness do we want these students, these young people, these humans to emerge out of on the other side of? Do we want them to be, do we want their consciousness to be framed and constrained by the debt that they take on, which means the kind of work that they might do, the kinds of contributions that they might make, they might not, if they're carrying the burden of having to make different kinds of decisions, living in the economic apartheid zones that we understand this world, the sacrifice zones, really, that we understand ourselves to live within, or need to understand ourselves more to live within. So this is where this broader kind of questioning about not just abolishing the debt, whatever debt that is, medical debt, student debt, carceral debt, but also abolishing and thinking about how we not just end, but construct and build and think more generatively about the kinds of worlds we want to build that are absent those sorts of conditions that give rise to even the kind of dichotomies and, you know, I think profound lived ambivalences around that debt. I too, when my wife and I, you know, the first thing that we did, one of the reasons why we delayed having children is because we paid off our debt. We couldn't, like so many of our friends were buying homes and buying property, and we were like, no, we got to pay off the debt that we accrued in our long march through the institution because we did not have family support, right? Mm-hmm. And we did have some support, actually. We had certain kinds of support in certain sorts of ways. But we were saddled by more than you just named, Chidima, right? Because of all the ways in which we understood that we had to subsidize this process of getting an education that, in fact, we would discover, as again, you noted, then when we enter the institutions as we did with PhDs, right? What do we find but the adjunctification of the university, right? Which is to say that more and more of us are paid less and less in all kinds of piecemeal, incremental ways that are devastating to our families, to our communities, and to our capacities to actually live lives that are, and this is part of the work that we did at our own institution, part of that vision of becoming anti-racist and health promoting was to deal with the health promoting in a way that was actually psychic and embodied, and to think about how do we live outside of these hierarchies that just extract from us all the time. Forever and always, it would seem. So I want to just think more capaciously for this moment, and also within the context of a union, beyond the bread and butter. I ain't saying that we don't have to deal with all these issues with respect to the pay gaps, with respect to all the sorts of differentials, all the inequities. Absolutely. They are profound, but in order to truly address them, we also have to deal with these structural issues that have produced the kinds of conditions in which we find ourselves historically.
And we have to keep re-examining our juxtaposition to power, to be clear. So I do totally work from a Pan-African perspective and work in the ideals of Ujima, a collective work and responsibility, right? And cooperative economics. And as some people here know, this is why this conversation is so interesting. So Keith, I walked away from my full professorship during the pandemic. I walked away from my retirement. I walked away from my kids' college education. So I understand when we walk within our spiritual work and when we commit to our soul work. And so, yes, I am positioned differently. So I do want to uplift and acknowledge a racial reality here, right? Because when I did that, I know that a lot of people followed behind me and said, we're going to jump off this ship. And what does that mean for us financially and as it relates to transgenerational or intergenerational consequences? And so that's why I think it's important with this moral debt and really, really highlighting economic apartheid, that we also talk about the reverberations, because I literally shifted not only my own children's reality, but also those people who was looking at me like, that's Dr. Professor. So what happened?
That's right. Absolutely. I mean, and the three of us are very connected to our communities and our ancestors and those that, and a desire to be good ancestors for those that are coming behind us. Not everyone feels like that. In addition, I was thinking, as you both were sharing, this reminds me of the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on terrorism, the war. So this war, these wars
War on
that
Black
our
people and
government,
Indigenous
it's
people,
the
working
war
people.
on Black people, it's not the war on low income people or poor people, it's the war on, right? So it's the people are now the target and institutions are part of it. So someone had a question comment, and so I will tease out the question for you two insofar as it seems like, so this is the comment question. It seems that the number one way of getting out of poverty is a college degree. Yet if that degree that improves someone's earning potential comes with a mortgage-sized piece of debt, how far ahead are people? And what about the folks that are trying to get through school but don't graduate? They oftentimes end up drowning in debt. They take on the debt that they took on in hopes that they would find a better way. And those of us that are on this call, many are graduate students, graduate employees, and we're told to grade our peers strictly to appear, right? So that perception of being academically rigorous, for example. Yet we also know that there are consequences. So we oftentimes talk about, I'm sure you two do, impact versus intent. And so even though someone doesn't intend to cause harm, the harm can still be present. And that potentially has the ability to have that person, because they've been graded so harshly, where they need to repeat a course, for example, which adds a bigger price tag. So the system is effectively turning us against one another into agents that are increasing the debt burden rather than mentoring, rather than creating that collective community and support for our peers. So where do we go from here, y'all? What do we do with this? How do we ensure that we're insulating ourselves and our community from being agents of this war on our peers or this war on others? What do we do?
I'll let Keith answer, because I think that Keith was already getting to the where do we go next at the really at the meso or macro level, not just individual. So I'll let Keith address that from.
Well, I appreciate that, Venus, but I actually I was hoping to learn from you in terms of your particular kind of embeddedness within policy circles, and I would love to learn about what it is that you're doing and what your perspective and insight is with respect to this. But it's one of the reasons why, I mean, briefly, it's one of the reasons why I thought it's so important to share with y'all the Debt Collective, because they're organizing debtors, and they've I don't know if people are familiar with Corinthian College, but it was one of the most rapacious, predatory private institutions that, I mean, it really shook down students, and then literally they would be in, massive financial debt, and then have a degree that literally meant nothing, right? That was not even regarded as accredited. And so, I mean, you can imagine the devastation of that. And it largely preyed upon Black and brown folks, Black and brown women largely. And so what the Debt Collective was instrumental in was organizing these, harmed former students, and they won a massive settlement, not just for debt relief, but also repayment, given the harm that was produced as a function of their experience. So I'm sharing that to say that there's a way in which this is what Stokely Carmichael / Kwame Ture used to always say: if you got a problem, there are three solutions: organize, organize, organize. And this is where, for me, the grounding has to be in how do we and this is why, again, I think this the language of the moral debt, the language of economic, or the framework of the analytic of a moral debt and economic apartheid is important to ground ourselves in that Walter Rodney sense, right? In which we understand that this is historic theft. This is not individual, right? This is historic violence. This is theft. And if we don't understand that, then how are we ever going to get ourselves into a situation where we can begin to move beyond the shame and say, hey, what's happening with you? What's happening with you? How can we begin? And I would propose that the Debt Collective, you could start a branch at UMass Boston, right? You know what I'm saying? But I want to say one other thing to what Chris, I believe that was Chris's question. I'm ministering to students all the time who are asking me this question all of the time. And I am thinking about this question all of the time when I teach, all the time, which is to say, why are we here? Why are they here? And what is this classroom space for? What is the sacred space of the classroom for, right? Which is to say, again, to return to that question of, yes, it's about hard skills. It's about a certain kind of capacity, but it's also about a certain kind of consciousness that enables us to understand that we have to begin to move towards the liberation, not just of ourselves, but of our communities. And once we understand that our liberation is bound up in one another, I genuinely believe we move differently in the world. We relate differently in the world, and we tend to enact right relations with one another in ways that we need to, not just with ourselves, but also with the earth. We have to change so much needs to be changed at this moment. But I think this question about what a university education is for at this moment, particularly given the indebtedness, is deeply linked to the historic question and problematic of the economic apartheid that Dr. Venus is talking about. And so, we need to have a clear analysis. And we need to organize.
So Dr. Venus, there was a question, and I'll drop the question in the chat. So we have another one, but I'm going to ask you for your researcher perspective, or what does the data indicate as far as the disproportionality of impact of student loan debt on non-traditional students. So Keith, you were mentioning that you and your wife made some sound financial decisions for you all to delay some things that you wanted in your life to resolve that. And so, did I misunderstand?
I only want to say
Possibly.
that I think the question of what it is that we want and what it is that we desire is a very complicated thing in a racial capitalist society. So I want to bracket that for a moment, because because the idea that because housing shouldn't be a desire or a want. You see what I'm saying?
Agreed. Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. And and this speaks to, so I'm going to drop that question about disproportionate impact on non-traditional students. Does it make a difference if people are coming into the space of higher ed a little bit later in life? Are they still having that impact? And then the other thing, and it kind of speaks to what you were talking about, Keith, is some of us have this tension of we're part of this problem and we don't necessarily want to be, and yet there's a need to be, kind of, in order to affect change in the way we want. So go ahead, Dr. Venus.
I'll start off with this disclaimer. Since Keith gave a disclaimer, I'm gonna start a disclaimer. What happens is when you begin to occupy this role, pun intended, you don't want to be a dream killer. So
That's right.
All of us today, even with the people who are here joining us in this conversation, I'm guessing most are graduate students or tenure track faculty or work in a university position. I'm guessing. With that said, we at some point have to be honest in the fact that a lot of universities are turning to Black and brown people simply to keep their doors open. It's not to say that the Black and brown people are any less qualified, intellectually, acute to participate. Not at all. That's not what we're questioning. What we're questioning is what happens when you promise a group of people access to your institution, knowing that it's at a higher price tag with a higher interest. Again, you're pulling them out of the paid labor force. Or when we're talking about non-traditional students, let's be honest, we're talking about Black and Latinx women or Latinas. Let's be clear. And they're going to come in. They're still trying to work full-time jobs. We've all seen it. They're still trying to work full-time jobs. Many of them are raising pets or children. Many of them are even taking care, in some cases, their family members, their older family members, even if it's just checking to help mama with a bill or two. Let's be honest, okay? And they're trying to go to school full-time. They want to show up to our courses. What do? We show up for them, right? And we don't do like the faculty before us did, where you had the 1-page syllabus. We're not even going to talk about that, right? So now we got the 20-page syllabus, right? With like these disclaimers, like, I understand that you may not be able to do this assignment, blah, blah, blah. But faculty aren't even mentoring in the same way. We're not advising in the same way. So the reality is that our student population has changed, but our ways of doing academia has not changed.
That's it.
And then, so our students are taking a longer time to completion. And also, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news because I am a dream weaver. But to be honest, many of the traditional institutions, the same one that have opened up the doors and said, come on in, give us your time and give us your funds, right? These are the same ones that wouldn't even necessarily hire these groups of students first, because they feel like these aren't the type of students where they truly committed. And so for the non-traditional students that may be here joining us today, what we're talking about is many of us were recruited into colleges and universities at I'm speaking for myself, in the 20s. Many of us know that colleges and universities tend to recruit younger faculty or people who are interested in tenure track positions at younger ages, because you're talking about time in. They want to invest for the long term. They do care about what type of institution you went to. We're still talking about who did you work with? Who was your advisor? Who wrote your letters? And we're trying to ignore this, but we, still sit in front of these Zoom rooms. We still sit in front of our non-traditional students and we pretend like the playing field is equal, when we know that we didn't even invite them to the right playing field. We gave them a whole different map. They're not even in the vicinity of where the game is being played. So that's where I was having a moral conflict, not an ethics.
That's right.
Universities are damn good at ethics. Well, we're not so good.
Yes, we are.
Moral aptitude, and let's be honest there. So what we have to do in this fight for our liberation, for our freedom, right? If we're going to talk about racial justice, economic justice, we actually have to get honest, and we have to be we have to give our students the freedom papers. So we have to think from an abolitionist perspective if we are true dream weavers and not killers.
That's right. I love everything about what you just said. So Jack has a comment, a question. What if, based on analytics, there was a reason to analyze and boycott certain colleges, universities? So what are your thoughts on that? It's very abolitionist of you to bring on the boycotts. Thoughts?
I'm going to operate, I'm not going to get caught up between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington here. I think I'm going to take the easy way out. I used to say when I was young and less thoughtful, 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, I used to say that I'm going to burn this MF up from the inside out. I used to say that. But now, to be more thoughtful and reflective in the middle of racial reckoning and a health pandemic.
That's right.
Yeah. Instead, I'm going to lean towards Fannie Lou Hamer. We are workers. I don't care about this hierarchy. You know, we are workers, and what we are calling for now, to everybody's point here, right, is we're just calling for workers' rights. I don't care where you're at in this social order, because at this point right now, a lot of the Black and brown folk who did make it into the academy, whereas before, and some of you probably have read my work, where before we would have, you know, these white men in the coats, these lab coats, go out, leave the ivory tower, go out into native lands, cross oceans, and research us to figure out how to subjugate us and oppress us. Now we're just inside these institutions, coming out the ivory tower, going into our own neighborhoods and communities, and going back in and telling these institutions how to oppress us more easily. So really what we want to turn to workers, coalition building, and struggles for freedom. And I do believe, as a dream weaver, this is the time that we can reimagine our relationships with these institutions, our relationship with money and wealth, our relationship with labor. There's nothing wrong with labor. What is wrong with how it's exploitive capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, imperialism, because it's raping us all. It's raping the land, it's raping natural life, meaning habitats, meaning plant life, water life, even the air we breathe, and it's raping us physically. And Black women, Indigenous people are going to be the first ones who wither away from this type of labor.
It's brilliant. And I just, you know, there's so much of what you just said that I would want to uplift. The neo-colonial formations you named are real and important. I mean, this question of where the pressure points are is always the one that I think we return to, right? I mean, where are we in relation to these structures, and what work can we do to ensure that all labor has dignity, as Dr. King said, which is another way of saying that all life has dignity, right? And when I mean all, I mean all. And that's not a thing that typically is meant, and hasn't been meant typically, historically, structurally, juridically, within the West. Can you hear my kids there? Can you hear my kids quarreling there? No? Okay, good.
No, but it's a beautiful sound.
I mean, they might, you know, well, it might tumble.
They're our future.
That's how that happens, you know?
Glad you had them, Keith, by the way. Glad you had them.
I am too. I mean, sometimes, well, never mind, but you know. But it was, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, because it was a real, I mean, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, when you were evoking the dream killer and the dream weaver, I couldn't help but return to Bettina Love's notion of soul murder, right? Are you familiar with this in terms of abolitionist teaching and a certain sort of pedagogy and practice that I think she just so, you know, profoundly names? And I love this notion of dream weaving. And part of what I think, you know, to this question specifically about these universities, I think we have to think about how we, you know, work from the inside out. This is sort of the work that, you know, Professor Vandermeer and I, you know, and Dr. Venus, this is something that we undertook work, labor organizing efforts that we undertook at our institution, to combine all the unions, to combine staff, to combine tenure, non-tenure track faculty, administrators, to really begin to reimagine what the university might be beyond hierarchy, and to really think about, you know, what anti-racism might be if we were to operationalize it in a health promoting sense. And that was really deep, right? A deep kind of like reckoning, right, in a serious way, with these histories that have produced the kinds of conditions whereby the university reproduces and clones itself in all manner of ways that only just results in a perpetuation of all the mechanisms of brutality that we're trying to undo. And so how do we make these spaces, like, just not, I mean, in our own classrooms, we can do this, spaces of liberation, but how do we do it sort of broadly across campus and transform the campus itself? And how do we do that among institutions and be models and leaders and organizers and activists humbly, but nevertheless, trying to bring this sort of work out into the world in a way that actually is truly transformative, because we don't have a lot of time left. I mean, that's genuine. I mean, I'm, like, I really feel that. And I feel that even, reverberating, right? The vibrations, if you will, even of this other kind of genetic life that's bounding about in the other room right there. I mean, I feel that, right? And this sense of being a good ancestor, I mean, this is, Janine, we've talked a lot about this, is really deep. My abuela had a 6th grade education. She worked in sweatshops.
That's
I
right.
think about her all the
That's right.
time. I was just evoking her the other day with a student, Dominican Colombian student, great younger undergraduate of mine, who's trying to understand his place in the world and what it is that he is here for, right? In the midst of like all the other struggles of all the working that is being extracted from him elsewhere. And then all these classes in which he doesn't feel like he belongs, but is paying money to get an education that he doesn't understand has any kind of bearing on the world that he might enter when it's one he doesn't want.
Yeah.
And so this question then has to, I think, and this is one of the reasons why the Bettina Love mattered to me, because she was just actually asked to come to our campus to speak. And I think of her work as really sacred. But let's just say that the conditions under which she was brought were those that, again, impact and intention, perhaps not the intention, but the impact has been such that it has actually undermined the capacity to do the work that Bettina Love has been brought to say that we need to do. And this is and so I honor what you were saying earlier, and I actually wanted to ask you, Dr. Venus, about your experience with respect to white fragility, the obstacles, right, that are in place. But I don't know if you all, we've been talking a lot about this, thinking about it, my colleague and I. There's this incredible text called Plantation Politics and Campus Rebellion. I don't know if y'all have seen this. I highly recommend this, highly, because it is also a way to talk about how the colonial universities are bound up in plantation-like legacies. And if we don't understand those structures, we don't understand how power reproduces itself, we don't understand the neocolonial formations, Dr. Venus, that you were referencing a moment ago, then we are just also going to produce and minoritize, if you will. I mean, though that's a kind of deficit-based term that I actually kind of want to refuse. But nevertheless, there will be then students who have our histories, who have had our experiences, who then go out and don't recognize, because of the training that they've received, all the ways in which they're participating in the very kind of mechanisms that have pressed them in their communities for generations, if not centuries.
And I do want to say, I work with Bettina, I call her Bet. Her and I published together. So I just want to make sure we give credit where credit is due. Critical race feminist scholar Patricia Williams actually coined the term spirit murder in 1992. And Bettina Love, she applied it to processes in education in her most recent work. So, and I just point that out because as we're thinking about, like the intersectionality of these moral debts and economic apartheid, liberation struggles, we definitely need to think about these conversations from its roots. So a nod to what Keith just said, by the way, right? This started 400 years ago. And with that said, this is how I know that many of us are not only complicit in these systems, but we do have to do this excavation work, this spiritual, cultural, and intellectual excavation work where the university almost died 2 years ago. Y'all know that, right? Like we saw the universities trying to figure out, they were in a crisis. Many did close. Many were folding. Many couldn't keep their doors open. Many went into debt.
That's right.
And here we are now, right? We have chosen to reinvest back into higher ed as opposed to reimagine it. And as you all know, I know Keith knows this because he's definitely crunching the numbers. That's why y'all leading strikes all over the country. They know where to find us, y'all. That's for sure. But
Truth.
certainly, they actually made profit. What are we doing? Right? They are perfect this last fiscal year, even though they almost died off. What we now know as the universities almost died off. Just a year or two ago, right? Yeah, really interesting.
Well, and so we are sadly at that point. So we will likely go a few moments over 7:30, and hopefully my guests will be able to stay on just a few minutes after. There are two more questions. So the last question is just a one-word answer from both of y'all. So I'm having you commit to just a one-word answer. And you have a few more words in this next question. So one of the questions in the Q&A is there's a lot of criticism of student loan forgiveness, and some of this you've touched on, between Democrats and moderates, framed around the claim that student debt forgiveness in terms of dollars would mostly benefit white folks in the upper middle class. Similar to, I mean, if we want to be honest about affirmative action and who the beneficiaries were, primarily white women. So it seems to the questioner that this tactic is devised to turn progressives against one another. And there's curiosity about both of y'all's thoughts on history and use of this narrative. So so it's in the chat now, a brief response to this, and then I have one more question, and then we will close, and we will make sure that the books that were mentioned are dropped in the chat, as well as how to get in contact or remain connected to these amazing humans. So either one of you can tackle this, one of you can tackle it, or
Go ahead, Vina.
Keith, are you deferring? Okay.
Because I'm gonna, if I had a one word, complex. It's complex.
So I'm gonna use this time, y'all. See how I do? Follow what I do. So I'm gonna say, Dr. Venus, Dr. Key, would y'all come back for another conversation next semester?
Can that be rolled? Pay Black women. No, just kidding. You know, that's what my LinkedIn says. But that's what my LinkedIn says. That's what happens when you leave the university in the middle of a pandemic. So no, I would say yes. I think this is an important conversation, and I too believe wholeheartedly, from my heart space, not here, that this conversation is a part of our healing journeys. I'll leave it there.
100%.
We're healing. This is how we heal.
That's right. Yeah. And when we have these conversations and name the things and be honest with ourselves and be as transparent as we can, because each time we do it, we're that much closer to healing, right? Healing that is ours to have, you know? So, all right. Now my question, so this is the question that is a one-word answer. This is all a lot of work, right? What we're talking about, it is not easy. So, and you all's broader work. So remind us or tell us, how do you each self-care? So one word, one sentence, what do you do for your own healing that you feel comfortable sharing with folks that are attending? Did you say soul work? Oh, you'll definitely return. Yes, it worked.
I'm still learning. I'm still learning self-care. Shadima, as you know, as clinicians, we know that even this idea of self-care has been co-opted.
It sure has.
By the private marketplace. So with that said, I have to continue to intentionally do check-ins it's a process. I love when Keith said, you hear the kids in the background, at least you hear your children. I think
Mhm.
now as this work has moved into the private space, what we before thought, wow, I'm still near my family, right? I'm near my children. My daughter is just asleep. And my baby, my dog is my baby. He's sitting patiently at my feet. I love to hear his heartbeat on my feet.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I had to practice during the pandemic meditation. Because as you all know, a lot of that transgenerational trauma, it's embodied, it's in our central nervous system. It's carried, our brainstem to our spine, right? So I could have easily become like an alcohol addict during the pandemic. Like I was like, but instead I turned to meditation, yoga, self-reflection, and I began to pour into other Black women and women of color as a part of being connected. But somehow I woke up and I was reconnected to the matrix. And so I don't take that term self-care for granted, especially as a clinician who, and I can see the worst of things, to be honest, right? I just, let's just put it that way. And self-care to me is my meditation practice. And it's just standing in bold truth telling at this point. That's the only way that I can remember to hear Keith's children, to hear my children, and to feel my dog baby's heartbeat. He's a Yorkie, so I can feel his heartbeat. Could you imagine how connected that is? So it brings me not joy. I know God if I could hear Keith's children.
That's right. That's right. I love it. So Keith, you're up. How do you self-care or take care of yourself? Join in your healing.
I think for a lot of my life, how much time we got? No, I think for a lot of my life, I only had the most destructive models for what quote unquote self-care was, which is to say, I suppose, what self-medicating was, It took me a long time to realize what I had very early on, very intimately lived, which was the knowledge that a lot of the adults in my life were just hurt children or damaged children. And I've deeply tried. I mean, and I think there's another register of debt I would like to at least close and gesturing towards. So I'm going to kind of try to make my way towards that. I think that so during the pandemic, a way to at least, telescope this for the moment. I stopped drinking at all. Like I stopped drinking alcohol and I stopped drinking coffee and I started doing yoga. I mean, I did it in other moments of my life, but there was this interesting and kind of like urgent calling that I felt. Because my wife is, some of my wife is a physician and she was on the front lines. So she would leave for like 14 hours and I'd just be alone with the kids. She'd like be in PPE all day. And there were days, there were whole periods where like we started figuring out what our will was, like we had to have all these adult conversations all of a sudden. And there was this moment where I realized, in a deep kind of, internal reckoning that all the models that I had for caring for my family and caring for myself and caring for my wife, caring for like my beloved community, they were all really pathological. And they were all, sort of indebted to, if you will, a kind of escape from addressing the real kind of conflicts and hurt that was right in front of me. So that was, I think that what I appreciate about, or among the things I appreciate, Venus, about what you just articulated and shared was that I think I had to find what that was for me in a way that allowed me to feel it authentically. And there was something about having to do yoga at home, like not having to go, because I think one of the things that, here's this like the reveal, right? And this is a very probably masculinist thing that I totally, have to admit to still having to learn how to undo, but this was part of the process, is that yoga for me also had become competitive. It's like, once that happens, it's done. But really, you've lost it, right? Like the moment you're looking around at everybody and you're like, yeah, it's like, forget it.
Yep.
But what had happened in the pandemic is that I could do it with myself, and I could be with myself, and I was forced to be with myself.
That's right.
And my wife and I do it together now, but like, that was a really important process for me, in the midst of all the other struggles, is just to begin to inhabit my body differently, wholly, in a way that was also less judgmental.
That's right.
And to learn how to breathe again. And I still try to feel like, and in that era when we were all, this, I can't breathe, thinking about how deeply embodied that is, this not being able to breathe, felt differently among different populations.
Yeah.
But there is this moment, I think, that we all have to kind of contend with almost daily. Like, I often feel like a boot's on my chest, and I don't want to live that way. I don't want them to live that way. I don't want anybody's children to live that way. So I love this idea of the heartbeat of your dog on your feet, because that's just a beautiful kind of musicality with respect to also the life source of all of us and of all things and all matter. And this is one of the things that I want to say about debt. So my mentor, somebody who's had an incalculable kind of influence upon my thinking and very being, is Fred Moten. And in his work, I don't know if folks are familiar with the undercommons. It's a thing that kind of circulates and such, but he in his work, he does a lot to kind of think through the complexities of what it means to be obligated to one another. And there's debt actually we have, and there's debt we can't repay, and there's debt actually we should never repay, and that's the ancestral stuff, right? I am indebted in ways I can never repay, right? That's the whole paying forward too, right? I think about that all the time when I'm with my students, because there's so much that I was given. I was loved enough to also be part of this tradition that's so important to me, right? Black studies is important to me because of the way in which I was loved by my Black professors that gave me a different kind of life. And not just Black professors, Black women in my life, all manner of friends who loved me enough to share this with me, right? And so I feel like an incalculable debt that I don't know, I can only repay in these moments when I feel like I'm also contributing in a way that does the healing work that needs to be done for and the building of the beloved community. I don't know how to do this otherwise. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so that's really deep to me, because that's not dissociated from or cannot be disentangled from.
That's right.
The self-care work also, if you understand the self not to be an individual neoliberal kind of construction, but one that's always bound up in community and entangled in the otherness of other people's lives, which is why I was saying earlier that until we begin to realize how deeply our liberation is bound up in one another's, I don't know that we'll be able to save ourselves or anything else.
That's right. So on that beautiful note, you both mentioned essentially collective care, and during this, because I'm a mama, probably first, well, I'm a human first, and I was texting with my husband to make sure Joy Drop, whom both of you all have met through Zoom, is okay. And he's like, she's fed, she's changed, she's in bed, and I couldn't be, right? I couldn't be here without him, and I wouldn't be here without my mother and my grandmother and my great grandmother. And Joy Drop, I know she looks at me and is deeply connected to me, even within hours, knowing my voice, because that's who she's known, right? And so as we leave this space, and this is a sacred space, I want us to remember that. And that just means I'm not hoisting religion on anyone. Sacred means set apart. And so we are in this time and space together. And who knows if we'll be joined again at a later time. So we have this, and we have our charge of what we are to do with this information and how we can show up for ourselves and one another in this collective care, in this collective work. And so deep debt of gratitude to the two of you. Keith, Dr. Venus, thank you so much for choosing to spend time here, sharing your insight, revelations, humility, and the fact that you said, Dr. Venus, I'm still learning, is huge. And to walk away from some of the things that we were told are the things we should be pursuing, that's incredible. And to recognize I was in competition with others when I was on my yoga mat, and I had to step back and reconnect with my breath. That's sacred. And so thank you all who are in the audience for sharing space with us. We will be sharing this recording. We will share, to the extent that we can, resources and recommendations that were dropped in this chat. Again, you all are all amazing. Well, the two of you are amazing, and certainly anyone who's on this call, we thank you from the GEO as well as GSA. And so everyone have a wonderful rest of your evening, day. I don't know where everyone is. Just take good care of yourself and one another. Thank you all.
Thank you. Gratitude.